Hello, my name is Dov Tryman, and I will be with you for the next half hour to discuss LLC liability with regard to short-term rentals, the legal risks, municipal enforcement, those kinds of issues. Now, I have done similar talks that are as much as 2 hours in length. So here, when we're talking about a half hour, as you can imagine, we're doing what you used to take in college as a survey course, which is to say we're only going to be hitting the high points, and we're not going to be going into terribly much depth. That's the bad news. The good news is that if you have questions where you want a little more depth, you can email them to me. My email address is extremely easy to remember. You see my name on the screen, Dov Tryman. My email address is dovtryman@gmail.com. And any communications that you'd like to send to me in the way of feedback on this presentation or in the way of asking for a more detailed explanation of some point that I cover in this presentation, I would be most happy to do that for you. Normally, I give a fairly extended self-description as to the background that I bring to this issue, but as you can well imagine, you don't want to chew through a significant fraction of a half hour just to find out how many books I've written and how long I've been practicing law and where my focus is and that sort of thing. Understand that my main focus of practice is in Lower Manhattan, and that is where my office is located, but we handle cases throughout the New York City region, not just within New York City itself. And this has come to be an extremely important issue, not only on the island of Manhattan, but also throughout New York City, indeed throughout New York State, in my direct experience, and in a somewhat broader experience, as I have been doing these lessons now for several years. It has come to my attention that throughout the country, these short-term rentals are a significant risk. We are specifically speaking about LLCs today, so I will be taking a look at it from that point of view. But as you can well imagine, the risks for an LLC are going to overlap considerably with any other kind of ownership of a building, whether it be a small single-family home or whether it be an apartment house with hundreds of apartments in it. These risks will be in common whether we are talking about an LLC, whether we are talking about an individual proprietorship, whether we are talking about a partnership or a traditional corporation, or any of the other kinds of business entities that we see. I will, however, be focusing on LLCs because, of course, that is the overall topic of today's presentation, but also LLCs do have unusual features to them which lead one to believe that the liability is more limited than it really is when it comes to short-term rentals. So let's take a look at that. The first thing we need to do is understand that nobody in the industry calls this short-term rentals, regardless of who the listing service is for the short-term rental. In the law field, we refer to this as Airbnb. And I fully appreciate that that makes it sound like somebody who is talking about using a Kleenex as a tissue or Xeroxing a copy of something, but that is where we are with this. People talk about this as Airbnb, regardless of who the provider is. And what is useful about Airbnb as terminology, even if it's inaccurate in that there are other competitor providers, what's useful with that term is we know exactly what we are talking about. Just as if somebody says they're going to Xerox a document, they don't have to say they're going to make a photostatic copy of it. We know exactly what they're talking about. It has been my experience in dealing with New York City, and in fact, I lived in New York City for a considerable period, that New York City is a cluster of small towns. You don't realize this, but there is a culture within each apartment building. There is a community within each apartment building. So one experiences something of small town life within an apartment building in New York City, even though there are thousands of those apartment buildings. So the big city perspective on Airbnb is remarkably similar to the small town perspective. Now, we will note that there are, varying across the country, and indeed varying across New York State, different statutes and ordinances that deal with this issue. New York City has one of the strictest ordinances, and the way it handles it nowadays, they tried handling it a different way and ran into constitutional problems. But the way they handle it now is that if an apartment is being put up there as available for Airbnb, then it has to be registered with the city. And when we get into further depth in the ordinance, we'll see what that registration requires. And in many instances, what it requires is impossible for a renter to provide, and therefore the ordinance makes it actually illegal to run the apartment as an Airbnb because it simply cannot meet the requirements of those ordinances. And we'll get into that. Now, one of the things that we're going to have to look at on a national basis is just exactly what do we mean by short term. And there you're going to be looking at the statutes and ordinances, statutes being from a state, ordinances being from a municipality that is smaller than a state. And you will see that some are going to talk about renting out space for fewer than 7 days, or fewer than 30 days, or fewer than 60 days, or less than 1 month. Now, notice that 1 month and 30 days is not a synonymous pair. You look at 1 month, if the statute says for less than 1 month, then you have to contend with February, which has either 28 or 29 days, and you, on the other hand, have to contend with August, which has 31 days. So 1 month could be longer or shorter than 30 days. You have to look at the statute or ordinance to see which one is meant by the term short term. Leases may define that. You may be in an area of the law where there are no statutes or ordinances that speak to the question of doing Airbnb, but the leases may define it. And the lease may define it as 1 month or 30 days. It may define it as less than, or it may define it as more than. So you have to do a careful reading either of the statute or of the ordinance or of the lease to determine just exactly what it is that is being prohibited, whether we are talking about a maximum period or a minimum period, a period defined by the calendar, or a period defined by the calculator. These are things that you're going to have to look into. Oral agreements can be involved as well. And we understand that the law does generally allow for oral leases. The problem, of course, with oral agreements is that they are set up to guarantee that the parties are going to disagree as to what exactly they orally agreed to. So if you are representing either a landlord or a tenant in this, you're going to want to discourage oral agreements, because the advantage of written agreements, as difficult as they may be to interpret, at least we can all agree on what the language that needs to be interpreted is. Now, there can be, when it comes to Airbnb, tax issues. And when you're dealing with tax issues, you have to understand that nationally, I have come across municipalities, such as in California, where the focus of the local ordinances restricting Airbnb usage are doing it for the sake of ensuring that the taxes that would be applicable to a hotel are getting collected. In New York City, the issue is not so much making sure that the municipality is properly funded by the collection of hotel taxes. The focus there is to protect the hotel industry, and they have their own lobbying that they do that causes this to be very strong. And the New York City ordinance is indeed one of the strongest ordinances that we have seen. The other thing when dealing with tax issues that you have to take into account is the difference between the actual law, which is that the tax is collectible whether the payment for the occupancy is in cash, or if the payment for the occupancy is put on a credit card, or if there's a check or some other kind of strong paper trail. And while that is the law, we find very frequently that there is this attitude, green is clean. And the attitude there is that if a payment is made in cash, then for tax purposes, it doesn't really exist. And therefore, the tax is not being charged to the one who is making the payment, and the tax is not being collected by the recipient of the payment, and of course, it's not being turned over to the governmental authority that is entitled to have this tax. This, however, is an extremely difficult problem for an LLC, because as much as you might think that limited liability means that if the LLC fails to pay the taxes that it is supposed to be paying, then it's the LLC's problem, and dissolve the LLC and we're good to go. That, however, is not the way the law actually operates on this thing. What happens is that the owners of the LLC are seen as being personally guilty of tax fraud, and the governmental agencies that are entitled to the tax will be prosecuting them in their individual capacities. The LLC will not shield them against that level of criminal or sometimes quasi-criminal liability. Now, you understand, of course, that this is going to vary considerably with the municipality that is involved. There will be cities that will go after the owners hammer and tongs, completely passing through the LLC entity. There will be others who will see the LLC as a shield. Tax law and avoidance of taxes is not an area of my practice, but you certainly are going to want to be certain that you have a tax specialist who's dealing with that issue when it comes up. This is not something that you want to mess around with as an amateur. You have to be very much aware of the concept of indirectly in control and non-delegable duties. This is an extremely important concept in New York City when it comes to the various building codes, and New York City has various different building codes. There is the building code itself, there is the housing maintenance code, there is the environmental code, and so on. And one of the features that these codes have in common is that for many of them, not only is there a liability for complying with the code that is cast upon the owner of the real property, but there is also a liability for anyone who is indirectly in control of the property. And that means, in the instance of what we're discussing today, the owners of the LLC, being in indirect control, have what the law calls a non-delegable duty, and they have therefore a direct responsibility for complying with these various codes. And doing so can be extremely complicated, because when we're dealing with Airbnb, what we're doing is we're taking a building that was constructed for long-term apartment use, or even a single-family home for that matter, that was constructed for long-term permanent residency, and using it for transient occupancy, which is familiar to most of us as the hotel scenario. And where this gets very strange is that the municipalities will regard the Airbnb as a de facto hotel, and therefore will the building codes, plural, are different for apartments and hotels. The same building is going to have to comply with both. So it may be in this particular municipality that sprinklers are not required for an apartment house, or they are optional for an apartment house, but they are required for a hotel. We're talking, of course, about the fire extinguishing sprinklers. There can also be differences in signage. One of the most significant differences in signage in New York City when it comes to a hotel is the door to the hotel has to have a sign on it posting the escape route, the fire safest escape route. There is no such requirement for an apartment, and therefore the failure to have those signs posted can find that even though it is the tenant who is renting out this unit as a de facto hotel, it is the landlord who is liable to the city for not having the sprinklers, for not having the signage, for not having the other things that we're going to be looking at very briefly. And the fines for those failures can be quite literally bankrupting. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. Now, why are the fines so stiff? For the very reason that the city is looking to shut down hotels that are not paying hotel tax, And of course, the city is looking to shut down hotels that are competing with the hotel industry. So those two motivations will cause the city to impose absolutely immense fines for these violations of the building codes that are applicable to hotels rather than applicable to standard apartments. And here too, those fines can be imposed straight through the LLC to the owners of the LLC, who have a non-delegable duty because they are indirectly in control. You will find in some municipalities there are door swing issues where an apartment door has to swing into the apartment and a hotel door has to swing out into the corridor, or it could be the other way around. Municipalities have all kinds of ideas about which way the door has to swing. And obviously, unless we're talking about one of those old saloon doors that goes in both directions, you can't be in compliance both with the hotel requirements and the apartment requirements with a door that only swings one way. Corridor width could be another issue. There may be a requirement that hotels have broader corridors than apartments do, or the other way around. Emergency lighting. Again, there have to be emergency lights, perhaps a different requirement for a hotel than there is for an apartment building when it comes to emergency lights. And keep in mind, when it comes to emergency lights, this is a really good example of something that even if the tenant wanted to be in compliance with the law, they would not be in a position to comply with the law because they can't put up the emergency lights out there in the corridor. So this is going to hit the LLC and its ownership absolutely directly. Fire alarms and safety devices, just like emergency lights. Safes. Hotels generally in many municipalities require that there is a safe present in the room, but of course apartments have no such requirements. Registration requirements we spoke about earlier. There are registration requirements in New York City for apartment houses. There are registration requirements for Airbnb units. Those requirements are completely different, and to a certain extent, they are mutually exclusive. So you're going to have to take a look at those registration requirements to see if it is even possible to comply with the law, with the registration that is required for an Airbnb. And it is the LLC, possibly its owners, that is going to be punished for that lack of registration, as will the tenant as well. Zoning. It may well be that hotels are simply not permissible in the particular zone where the apartment house is located. Or it may be that it is permissible if there are certain permits. So you're going to have to take a look at the permitting requirements to see how that works. Now, those are all with regard to the statutes and ordinances. When it comes to the leases that are being issued under which the tenant is holding a lease to the apartment, that can have its own requirements, but you're going to have to take a look because state law will frequently say no lease shall enforceably contain such and such clause. New York, for example, is a jurisdiction in which subletting is very much restricted by statute, and the subletting that the lease can prohibit is restricted, you're going to have to take a look at that. If you are a New York attorney, you're going to have to take a look at Real Property Law, Section 226B, which has an entire ritual for compelling the landlord to allow a sublet. But in compelling the landlord to allow it, there is this entire ritual that the tenant has to go through, and no Airbnb tenant can possibly fulfill the requirements of that so as to require the landlord to accept the Airbnb. Also, New York City's Airbnb regulation is very specific that if the lease does not allow the apartment to be registered with the city as an Airbnb, then the apartment cannot be so registered. The municipal prohibitions in New York City are found in 26-2101, which defines a booking service. And here's where we're not just talking about Airbnb, but of course, we're talking about all of its competitors. And you're going to want, if you're dealing with New York City, you're going to want to take a look at that section specifically to see what is included. I will note that in the leases that I draft, not only do I prohibit Airbnb, but I even prohibit that there should be ads placed on the bulletin board in a supermarket. So you might want to be a little more imaginative if you are representing a landlord as to just exactly what you are and what you are not going to allow, bearing in mind that you have to take a look at state law. You may want to disallow something that state law requires that you allow. Now, the other thing that I do in my leases is that I take the income from the Airbnb and I make it belong to the landlord, typically for an additional 20%, so that there is no profitability to the tenant in doing the Airbnb. Also, I will add an administrative fee for any fines that the city imposes, although generally speaking, the tenant is not going to be in any position to pay those fines. The landlord has numerous remedies when it comes to Airbnb, and one of those is self-help. Now, self-help is, in some municipalities, absolutely normal. And in other municipalities, it is extremely seriously discouraged. So much so that the landlord can be sent to jail. And once again, here the LLC structure is not going to give the landlord protection from this jail cell for using self-help. So you're going to have to take a look at your local laws to see whether or not self-help is allowed or disallowed. New York City, it's allowed limitedly. If, for example, there is someone standing with their suitcases about to enter an apartment, then New York City will allow the landlord peaceably to prohibit that entry to that apartment. But if they've been in the apartment for 31 days, then New York City is not going to allow them to be removed. Also, take a look at what's going on with administrative agencies. It may be that the landlord feels the motivation to contact a city agency to report the violation. You're going to have to take a look at the registration laws for that and see if that is an advantage or if that is a disadvantage to the landlord. If it's going to wind up where the landlord is being socked with hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, then clearly that's not something the landlord wants to do. But if it is so structured that the tenant is going to be socked with the fines and the landlord is going to be relieved of the illegal use of the apartment, then all the better from the landlord point of view. In order to implement this, as I said, I write these sorts of things into my leases. So here we will take a quick look at some lease clauses, and indeed very quick because we're running out of time. There is the possibility that the lease will actually allow for self-help, but you have to beware that such a lease clause may be void as against public policy. So you're going to have to be on the lookout for that. If, however, the law allows in your locality self-help, then having a lease clause that memorializes it can be an excellent idea. However, watch out. If you bring an eviction proceeding and then do self-help, the court may say that you've elected your remedy. So you're not going to want to go down that road either. You certainly want lease clauses that prohibit subletting without permission. And there you're going to have to take a look at state law. As I said, in New York, that actually works. As I said earlier, I've done lease clauses where I add on an additional 20% over what the tenant has collected in rental for the Airbnb usage. Also, I'll add on 20% for the fines that are imposed. Be careful, however, that you don't call it a penalty, because there are a lot of cases out there that say that penalties are unenforceable. And with that, I'm going to bid you goodbye. I do hope that this presentation was useful for you. And once again, I would remind you that if you have further questions, you can reach me at dovetryman@gmail.com. Thank you.
As stated during the beginning of this presentation, the link to initiate the certificate process will be displayed momentarily. My Law CLE would like to thank you for your participation in today's presentation.